has ever heard, oh, you're a communist. If you don't like this country, why don't you just leave, go to Venezuela, see how you like things there. Yeah. Okay, so you all know that Venezuela is used to scaremonger against the horrors of communism and socialism and dictatorship and so forth. In fact, if you remember last year, the House adopted a resolution that was warning against denouncing, it was the title of the resolution, to denounce the horrors of socialism. The resolution says, many of the greatest crimes in history were committed by socialist ideologues. I guess that doesn't include World War I or World War II, dropping the atomic bombs, the Vietnam War, the genocide of the Indian Americans, the genocide in Gaza, of course, but whatever. But anyway, the socialist ideologues are to blame for the greatest crimes in history, including people like Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Fidel Castro. It's a long list of names, and then the list also includes Hugo Chávez and Nicolás Maduro. And then it goes on to say that the implementation of socialism in Venezuela has turned a once prosperous nation into a failed state with the world's highest rate of inflation. And therefore, be it resolved that Congress denounces socialism in all its forms and opposes the implementation of socialist policies in the United States of America. So, comrades, this wave of anti-communist propaganda, I think, is not very credible coming from such hated politicians. I don't know if comrades remember how many people in the US have a very favorable opinion of Congress. Do comrades know the percentage? 2% of Americans have a very high, very favorable opinion of a great deal of confidence in Congress is the language of the poll. But anyway, so they're not very credible, but these ideas are out there. We encounter them. And I think it's very important as communists that we have clear answers for these questions. What was actually, in reality, the Venezuelan Revolution? What is happening in Venezuela today? Was Venezuela ever socialist? Is Venezuela a socialist country? And perhaps even start with the question, why is the ruling class and its media and its government so obsessed with Venezuela? And there's a simple reason for it. It's that the uprising of the workers, peasants, oppressed and poor in Venezuela was on the front line for nearly 20 years. It was on the front line of the world's struggle against imperialism and against capitalism. It was setting an example for the workers of the world, and therefore it was extremely dangerous for US imperialism and its lackeys. For a long time, the right wing and its ideologues described Venezuela as, right after the revolution, they said it was it had war zone crime levels, it has an authoritarian regime, a crumbling economy, and all of that was totally false. The truth is that Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil, fresh water, and gold, and also the world's second largest gas reserves, which makes it pretty obvious why the U.S. would be interested in preserving its control over this land. But the point is that for a period, the Bolivarian government after the revolution was able to use these the vast wealth in the country to implement extremely progressive reforms that massively lifted up the conditions of life of workers and poor in the country. At its height, the Venezuelan revolution was able to reduce poverty in half and reduce extreme poverty by 70%. At the same time as governments around the world were cutting funding of education and things like that, Venezuela doubled the education budget from 3.4% to 7% of GDP. Venezuela set up free higher education, creating 1.3 million new spots in university. It pretty much eradicated illiteracy by teaching 1.5 million people how to read and write. It nationalized and renationalized important sectors of the economy, built over 2 million fully furnished homes that it gave to people that needed them, most times for free. And remember, a lot of this was happening, around the time of the 2008 crisis, when in places like the U.S., people were getting kicked out of their homes. The banks were repossessing, foreclosing homes, and at the same time, in Venezuela, you had a government that was actually building homes and giving them to people that needed them. They also provided massively expanded healthcare, provided free healthcare with the help of Cuban doctors. They increased pensions and the number of people receiving pensions from 800,000 people to 2 million people. And very importantly, they set up state-run food stores and things like that helped to increase the calorie intake of Venezuelans by an average of 50%, reducing malnourishment from 21% of the population. 21% was malnourished prior to the revolution, brought it down to 5% of the population. So that, at the height of the revolution, that was what the Bolivarian revolution and the Bolivarian government meant to the people of Venezuela. Of course, the tragedy is that Venezuela was never socialist. This was always achieved on the basis of a capitalist economic foundation. And so although they did carry out some expropriation, key monopolies and key sectors of the economy remained in private hands, such as banking, the production and distribution of food, and many others. And therefore, it meant that as a result of the world crisis of capitalism, and especially after 2014, when there was a huge drop in oil prices, a lot of those reforms couldn't be sustained anymore. And so now, today, those descriptions of the right wing, the scaremongering, oh, it's chaos and devastation and poverty, that was a lie back then. But unfortunately, because it remained capitalist, those things today are true. And so we shouldn't have rose-tinted glasses when we look at these experiences. A failed revolution has meant misery now for people there. And the government of Maduro today is responsible for this, for strangling any attempts by the masses to organize, to fight back, and repressing the movement and enforcing capitalist rule and enforcing the enrichment of the oligarchy. And so this is why we always say that you can't make half a revolution. Either you go all the way, you actually overthrow capitalism, overthrow its state, and replace it with a state of, by, and for the workers, by a workers' government, or in the long run, the revolution will be defeated. And so if you get asked about it, well, what about Venezuela? I think we should be very clear that the failure of Venezuela is not a failure of socialism. It's a failure of capitalism. It's proof that one cannot regulate capitalism. You need to go all the way and overthrow it, or else, that's the consequences that you will face. All that said, I think it's important that we not just take a negative view on Venezuela, because again, the truth is that the Venezuelan Revolution was a hugely progressive event that has many, many important and very inspiring lessons that it's our duty as communists to learn from those lessons so that we can have a successful revolution here in the US and around the world. Trotsky described a revolution as the forcible entry of the masses into the realm of rulership over their own destiny. And that was precisely the main feature of all key events of the Venezuelan Revolution. The workers, the poor, and the oppressed, who were previously downtrodden and ignored, were given a stake in politics, were educated, they participated in those events, and they flooded the streets after Chávez, who was the democratically elected president, was overthrown by a coup. The masses flooded the street, and for the first time in history, a U.S.-sponsored coup was defeated by a mass, spontaneous uprising of the workers and the poor. And so they, like I said, they showed a huge level of consciousness, and the workers organized themselves and directly participated in those events. There were a huge number of organizations, sort of rank and file, community organizations that were created, the Bolivarian circles, urban land committees, political education schools, health committees, revolutionary workers' councils, Bolivarian trade unions, factory committees for workers' control, peasant organizations, and all kinds of other neighborhood and cultural organizations. And so basically, again, people that had never participated in politics before became directly involved in deciding their own future. And I would say this is perhaps even more so than the reforms that I mentioned earlier. That's probably the biggest gain of the Venezuelan Revolution, that it actually gave workers and peasants and the poor a sense of their own self-worth and confidence in their own power and in their own ability to transform society. And that, of course, was the most dangerous thing for imperialism, for the oligarchy. And so that's why, in the name of so-called democracy, the US-backed opposition within Venezuela has carried out all kinds of reactionary attacks, from coup attempts to sabotage to sanctions and things like that, to try to strangle and destroy the revolution. I don't have time, I don't think, to go in depth into this, but I try to summarize. I went through all the different coup attempts that were made in Venezuela in the last 10 years or so, last 20 years. 2002 coup attempt, 2004 another coup attempt. There's a gap there. I didn't do super extensive research. So between 2004 and 2010, there might be other coup attempts, but I don't have them in my list. But then in 2010, there's another one, 2013, another one, 2014, 2015, 2016. 2017, 2018, 2019. The one that you may be most familiar with, the most recent one, Juan Guaidó, self-proclaimed himself president. And he also said he was the commander-in-chief of the army. He had all kinds of titles that he made up. He actually had two coup attempts, one in February, three, I guess, sort of like one in early 2019, one in late 2019, another one in May 2020, which this is when the pandemic was raging in the US, and that's what the Trump government thought the resources should go towards strangling the Venezuelan revolution as opposed to investing in actually curing people in the US, you know? So comrades, point being, I think as communists in the US, we have to make it very clear that it is our duty to always defend the right of the aggressed against the oppressor, against the imperialist country. That's why early on, as soon as the revolution basically was raging, we launched the Hands Off Venezuela campaign, a campaign to raise awareness for the revolution and to defend the revolution against these imperialist attacks. And you know, it's not just about the coups and all that. Of course, the media, as I mentioned, played a horrible role throughout all of this. All kinds of slander and lies. Just a quick quote, when Chávez died in 2013, Republican Congressman Ed Royce, who was also the chairman of the US House Foreign Affairs Committee at the time when he died, said, "Hugo Chávez was a tyrant who forced the people of Venezuela to live in fear. His death dents the alliance of anti-US leftist leaders in South America. Good riddance to this dictator." I mean, the hypocrisy of, I just read out the list of coups, the hypocrisy to call a dictator to the democratically elected president. And how can you say that he was a dictator when literally, I mean, they had to try to overthrow him, you know, so many times over the course of a couple of decades, and they weren't able to do it because of mass resistance. It's an absolute distortion, an absolute lie. The truth is that in the eyes of the masses, Chávez represented and kind of personified the revolution. He actually was a figure that emerged on the scenes right after 1989, so he'd been around for a while. In 1989, what happened is there was, talking about imperialism, there was basically the IMF imposed a package of austerity, of liberalization of the economy, which of reducing price controls and things like that, which caused the price of oil to increase by 100%. So literally overnight, the fare prices of transportation, like buses, doubled or even quadrupled. And at the time, the workers of Venezuela, again, this is 1989, there was a huge anger, and they ignited a massive national movement against this IMF austerity, which became known as the Caracazo. And what happened in the Caracazo is, you know, it's like in so many other places, again, look at the hypocrisy of imperialism. They are silent about the misery that they themselves, imperialists, impose on all these countries. But, you know, they never talk about the conditions of life, say, in Haiti, a totally you know, they don't say the horrors of capitalism in Haiti or the horrors of capitalism in Colombia or in El Salvador or in Honduras. They only speak about these horrors when the masses dare to fight back and actually win, and that's when the U.S. actually was all up in arms. But in so many places, right, these austerity packages from Sudan to Sri Lanka to Bangladesh causes mass uprisings, as we've seen in the recent period. And a similar thing happened in Venezuela. The problem is there was no leadership, so all these movements rise up, sometimes even succeed in overthrowing the government, but there's no revolutionary alternative, and then the movement recedes back. So in Venezuela, in the Caracazo, there was no leadership, and the movement was absolutely drenched in blood. In fact, the police and the National Guard refused to shoot on protesters, because I guess they were a little closer to the people at the time. And so they had to send in the army, and they killed hundreds of people. I think the official count is around 300, but it was probably more like thousands of people got killed for protesting these things. And so there wasn't a leadership in the moment, but that leadership sort of crystallized a little bit later in the figure of Hugo Chávez, who was an army officer at the time, but he was disgusted by what he saw, and he actually wanted to fight back against it. So he organized a sort of coup. He wanted to have like a military people's uprising against the government and overthrow the government, from sort of kind of like wanted to free the people from this tyrannical government. The coup attempt was, I think, in 1992, but it was defeated. So he went to jail, but there were the people really liked him for the rhetoric he had and so forth. So they forced for Chávez to be released, and then he became just this very well-known figure that represented the aspirations of the masses to get rid of this government and against the status quo. And so he really struck a chord, and what he did is he was really close to the people. That's why they would say, oh, he's a populist, because the thing is he visited the poorest, the most oppressed layers in society that had up till then no stakes in politics at all. And he would actually talk to them about their problems and things like that, especially too, a lot of the time the poorest would also be the black population, indigenous population, and women as well, which ended up becoming one of the strongholds of Chavismo, was actually women and the most sort of the black and indigenous poor of Venezuela, which that in itself was an affront to the oligarchy of Venezuela, which is an extremely racist, backward. The fact that Chávez himself was mixed race, he was half indigenous, half black, is in itself kind of a great affront to this extremely racist, reactionary oligarchy ruling class of Venezuela. But the point is that Chávez had a very no bullshit, sort of direct style of just saying what was on his mind, saying things as they are. Just to give you an example of this, when he became president later on, he had a weekly TV channel, TV program called Aló Presidente, where people could literally just call him up and talk to him, ask him questions, And so, for example, on one of those TV broadcasts, he fired 5 of the 7 top managers of the oil company of PDVSA, corrupt and so forth. He had this red card that said, "You're out," and he would read the name and just pull out the record and say, "You're out," and this, So imagine the oligarchy literally tuning in on TV and finding out that half of their handpicked corrupt managers were being removed from the company. He also announced a 20% increase of the minimum wage for May Day. He made that announcement live on television, and you can see how this also hurt the kind of there's this aura of politics, that you have these professional politicians that are respectable, and there's a certain way you're supposed to dress and a certain way you're supposed to talk. And I think the petty bourgeois, the academics, all these people also in the West really couldn't tolerate Chávez because of his style even is something that clashed with this culture of capitalist politics. And so he established a really deep connection with the masses. There's another funny one I'll mention. In 2007, in this TV channel, he recommended people read was a transitional program by Trotsky, and he said, and possibly, by the way, Alan Woods, our comrade, was in contact with Chávez. They were good friends, and recommended things, and Chávez read a lot, and he took a lot of recommendations, some good, some bad. So it's possible that was a part of the influence for him reading Trotsky. And he said that the book, it's worth its weight in gold. He told this live to people on television. I very much respect Trotsky's ideas. He said the permanent revolution, for instance, is an extremely important thesis. I would say I wish he had really understood the lessons of that, actually. And he also said, talking about his popular style, that the book says that the conditions for socialism are rotten ripe, like a mango. So he's really trying to make this very vivid to people. But again, the problem is that he wasn't a socialist. He wasn't a Marxist. He had no understanding of the class character of the state. And importantly, even if he had all of those things, which he didn't have a party behind him. So that's ultimately what really doomed the Venezuelan revolution to defeat. But anyway, Chávez was eventually elected president in 1998 by a landslide. He won a big majority. And his program wasn't socialist. It wasn't a revolutionary program. He wanted to implement reforms. He wanted to have a constituent assembly, a national assembly, to put in place a new constitution, which would be a more democratic constitution, fighting for national sovereignty and all these, which in a sense is kind of like the task of the bourgeois revolution, right? To achieve national independence, to develop the national economy, to give land to the peasants. And that's kind of what he was trying to do. It was a constitution that guaranteed the bourgeois democratic right to private ownership, but it also had the right to healthcare, right to employment with adequate salary. So he talked about wealth redistribution. He wanted to guarantee the rights of the indigenous population, the right of recall of representatives. So if you didn't you don't have to wait 4 years to kick someone out if you didn't like them. You could, through a referendum and things like that, you could basically have a recall of your representative. And he wanted to fight corruption. So it was a very progressive program, which we would have supported as Marxists, but it wasn't an anti-capitalist program. And at his time, he summed up his own attitude as, He said, as much state as necessary and as much market as possible. So he didn't have a conception of the need to overthrow capitalism. But then the problem is that when Chavez went from words to deeds, often you can have the most beautiful constitution. Most countries have very nice constitutions. You can guarantee the right to healthcare and the right to a job with a good wage, but is that actually true? When Chavez actually went from words to deeds, that's when the ruling class really went into the offensive, when they realized that they couldn't just pay him off like any other politician. And again, this is a total confirmation of Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, that there is no progressive bourgeoisie in this epoch of imperialism. The Venezuelan bourgeoisie, as I mentioned, particularly reactionary, backwards, particularly corrupt and parasitic layer that was totally subservient to Western imperialism. And it emerged from the beginning totally enmeshed with the landowners, the big landowners of the latifundia, and with foreign capital. So it couldn't tolerate any of these reforms because it actually went against their own profits and benefits and against their right to plunder and own property. In particular, the land reform, Chavez tried to implement in 2001, land reform that took, similar to what another comment spoke about this earlier, taking unused land with compensation, so compensating, like basically buying unused land from the landowners and giving it to the poor peasants. At the time, less than 2% of the population owned 75% of arable land. That was a big landowner, so he tried to basically give the land to the peasants. But also land reform in the cities. There were most poor people in Venezuela. I think 80% of the population was poor, basically. And they lived in kind of slums, outside of the cities. And Chavez said, we're going to give you a right to the land where your house is. And he actually started giving people titles to the land of their houses. And of course, oil was a big one that also crossed the line for imperialism. As I mentioned, Venezuela has the largest oil fields in the world. It was at the time among the world's biggest exporters, and the U.S. was among the primary beneficiaries of that very cheap oil. And foreign companies, of course, were major players in the oil industry of Venezuela. Just to give an example, in 1930, just 3 foreign companies, that's Gulf, Shell, and Standard Oil, controlled 98% of the Venezuelan oil market. And so, that basically, when he threatened to basically reform the management of oil, by the way, the oil company PDVSA was already a nationalized company. So it wasn't that Chavez nationalized the oil. It had already been nationalized, but it had actually been done in a way where the former owners were still basically in control. It was being run really independently of any state management. And so Chavez tried to introduce reforms to renovate, to allow the state to have basically more of control and more of a say in how the oil company was run. He tried to impose higher royalties on oil profits, so basically higher taxes on the oil and so forth, which was totally intolerable and went against the interest of U.S. imperialism. I have a quote from George Tenet, who was the CIA director in, I think, 2001, 2002. He said, obviously, Venezuela is important because they're the 3rd largest supplier of oil to the U.S. at the time. He said, Mr. Chavez, that's how they pronounce it, and he didn't say President Chavez, he said, Mr. Chavez probably doesn't have the interest of the U.S. at heart. Now, why the Venezuelan president should have the interest of the U.S. at heart, ask the CIA director. But at this time, basically, the U.S. really went on the offensive. The Venezuelan oligarchy, in cahoots with U.S. imperialism, orchestrated a coup. That's in 2002. We're talking about the landlords, the bankers, the capitalist media, the Catholic Church, the army generals, the police chief, as well as the corrupt trade union leaders that were totally, combined with the state apparatus and so forth, and of course the CIA carefully orchestrated a coup that they had planned for months prior. The army tops came out against Chavez. Chavez was arrested and kidnapped, and meanwhile, an opposition demonstration, so of these right-wingers, was rerouted to clash with pro-Chavez protests, and there were snipers that started shooting on the pro-Chavez demonstrators, but all the media manufactured the images so that it would look like the Chavistas who were defending themselves against snipers. I mean, literally people were being killed, but the media made it seem like, oh, look at these Chavistas. They're so violent. They're causing violence. They want to kill. Chavez is a dictator. Every single channel was showing the same images of the capitalist private media were showing images of Chavistas defending themselves against the snipers, but they weren't showing the snipers. They only showed the violence, quote unquote, coming from the pro-Chavistas. And of course, the media also refused to give any airtime to pro-Chavez forces. They whenever there was Chavez actually, people came to the street to defend him, they wouldn't show any images of that either. And at the end of the day, they basically locked Chavez in a room and said, you either resign and leave and allow us to take over, or we're going to bomb the presidential palace. So there was like, that was the negotiation basically. Reminds you of, for example, Chile, right? And what happened to Allende. Chavez refused to resign, but he did say, I'm going to turn myself in. I'm not going to resign because this is an illegitimate coup, but turn himself in so that they wouldn't bomb the palace. And then Pedro Carmona was kind of the face of the coup. He was a wealthy businessman. He was the president of the bosses organization, Fede Cámaras. And he appeared on television, proclaimed himself the interim president. He proclaimed the dissolution of the constitution, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. He reverted all of Chavez's reforms, including oil. Basically, they lowered oil, increased oil production to lower prices so the U.S. could purchase it very, very cheaply. And the oligarchy, they were really happy. They thought, that's it, we've done it. I mean, how many times, we're talking about it, how many times has this happened in Latin America and around the world? The U.S. can just handpick whoever they want to be president, and they just do it. But this time it was gonna be different. The truth is that, the oligarchy, they were so cocky. They thought that, they were like flaunting around in the camera, the television was showing, oh, wow, we won. And they even signed a attendance kind of thing saying like, I was there when we overthrew the government. And so you had a list of 300 plus people that signed this thing saying I was there at the time of the coup. But within 48 hours, in spite of the media blackout, in spite of all the lies that were being spread, there was a spontaneous uprising of the masses. As soon as the news were heard that, because they spread the lie, oh, Chavez, even though Chavez didn't resign, they said, oh, Chavez resigned and he's escaping to Cuba. That was false. He was actually kidnapped. So as soon as the masses knew, no, Chavez has not resigned, he's standing his ground, and people knew he was alive and still in Venezuela, people started flooding the streets, and we're talking like, millions of people pouring out, surrounding the presidential palace and saying, we want Chavez back, we want Chavez back. And they were able to win over the rank and file of the military. There's images you can watch of the masses surrounding the palace saying, we want him back. And you can see the military that was kind of guarding the palace going like this, like, yeah, we're with you, And so just like that, basically, once the army had been, the army in that context could only have won over because the masses were pressuring and were able to basically reach out to them, right? It was a key element. And at that point, I mean, these reactionaries basically crumbled. The coup crumbled. They were arrested. Some of the people that did the coup were arrested. And Chavez was finally brought back. And this was a key turning point in the moment. By the way, when Chavez came back, remember there's the media frenzy showing all the fake lies and so forth. When Chavez came back, there was a media blackout, and they wouldn't talk about it. One TV station, just supposedly the top 24-hour news network, was showing images of 2 days prior of Chavez being arrested. That's after Chavez had already come back. I think the number one network, anyone want to guess what they were playing on the day of? Mickey Mouse, yeah, Disney. They were showing Disney cartoons, baseball games, nothing about what was actually happening in the street. There's a very good documentary that is titled "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," where you had Irish camera crew that actually recorded a lot of these events. I strongly recommend comrades watch it. But this was a key turning point. The masses, not only had they brought back the president again for the first time in history, they also went to surround the media buildings, throwing stones, and basically forced the media to play the truth, to say that Chavez had come back. At this point, remember, they had a list of the names of all the people that had participated in the coup. If someone had given the order, basically, had said, hey, now's the time to go on the offensive. They would have been totally justified to arrest everyone that had carried out the coup, expropriate their property. All of these were the bank owners and all this stuff, right? And that would have dealt a decisive blow, an irreversible blow to Venezuelan capitalism. There could have also been an appeal for the masses to take over, occupy the TV and radio stations and place them under workers' control so they can actually tell the truth instead of all of these lies. And so capitalism basically at that moment could have been overthrown. Capitalism in Venezuela in 2002 could have been overthrown, which would have been potentially a spark for revolution across Latin America and across the world. So what happened is Chávez comes, basically gives an appeal to the people after the coup. And he went there holding a blue book of the Constitution, which was kind of like the symbol of the movement. People wanting to defend the Constitution because it represented all those reforms that they were winning, right? So in one hand, while Chávez was speaking, he had this blue book of the Constitution. And in the other hand, he was holding a crucifix. And I guess he was a Catholic. He believes in forgive and forget and all this thing that's part of the Catholic ideology, forgiving your enemies, right? And so unfortunately, instead of making these appeals, seize the banks, seize all the major industries, seize the land, instead he tried to appease the counter-revolutionaries. There's a comrade, Jorge Martin, who's one of the co-authors of this fantastic book on permanent revolution in Latin America. He did an interview with a woman who was in the crowd at the time, a middle-aged woman. She was a Catholic herself, but she said when she saw Chávez coming out with that crucifix, that her heart sank because she knew that meant bad news, basically. And she said, instead of holding the crucifix, he should have held the sword of Bolivar, go on the offensive, kick out U.S. imperialism. But unfortunately, he had no thirst for revenge. He said he was willing to listen, Chávez said he was willing to listen to the grievances of the opposition, invited the coup plotters to a roundtable discussion as a sign of goodwill. He freed the coup plotters that had been arrested. And he thanked the masses for their support and told them, go home. And the masses went home. So that was a moment missed. The masses had mobilized spontaneously, which really showed the potential for the masses to rise up and to take power from the capitalists. But there were no organizational structures that would allow for a cohesive program and for a cohesive plan of action in the middle of that revolution. So in other words, a revolutionary party was missing. Instead, what you had was a single man, again, a very courageous man who wanted to act and wanted to act on behalf of the people. But he had no perspective of establishing a worker state or for how to actually successfully implement his program. He called for things like increasing the Bolivarian circle. So he called for more self-organization of the masses. But you can't just have a loose network of heterogeneous kind of organizations just doing things. You can't just grow parallel socialist structures within capitalism, which is in effect what he thought he would be able to do. What was needed was a nationally coordinated network of action committees in every neighborhood, in every army barracks, in every oil refinery, in every factory, in every landed estate, all the big lands. You needed those action committees to be linked up, elect their representatives, have a national leadership that could make the correct call and prepare the takeover of the main levers of the economy. That would have been the only way to really successfully implement the program, defend the new constitution, deter counter-revolution from coming back. But that didn't happen. And so sometimes people think like, well, if I back off, right? The reformist mentality is if I back off, make concessions, the right wing will be a little bit happier and they won't attack me. It's the opposite. You're showing weakness. You're showing if you do this, there's going to be no consequences. The right wing regrouped and they came back in the offensive, just a couple months later. The bosses organization, Fede Cámaras, and the corrupt trade union called a general strike. But this wasn't an actual general strike. When the bosses call a strike, that's not a strike, it's a boss's lockout. They had this idea of paralyzing the economy, paralyzing the oil refineries in particular, the PDVSA oil company, in order to create chaos. The oil was generated 80% of the country's wealth. So if you paralyze the oil production, that would basically cause huge chaos and potentially lead to the overthrow of the government. So that was basically a coup by non-military means is what they were trying to do. And again, all the media launched another campaign against Chávez, which, again, by the way, why did they remain in private hand? They were lying before, they continued to lie now. The right wing says Chavez is a tyrant, right? Like a dictator. In truth, it's actually the opposite. He was way too soft on these people and allowed them to carry out the sabotage for way too long. And so there was a lockout that was going on for nearly like over a month. They sabotaged the production of PDVSA, but this was defeated by the workers, who, with the help of massive demonstrations from all the poorest layers in society, were able to occupy and bring production back up for PDVSA. And this was repeated. It wasn't just the oil. For example, in the iron and steel industry, management supported the overthrow of Chavez, but thousands of workers requisitioned buses, company buses. They went to the gas plant, breaking through police lines, and they reestablished gas supplies to be able to keep production going. So what you can see at every step of the way, every time you had this kind of sabotage, there was a self-organization of the masses that they were emboldened. They supported Chavez and they organized themselves in order to bring the movement forward. They were able to bring oil production back to 70% capacity, not without problems, of course. They were learning as they went, but it really proved the lie that, this bourgeois prejudice that the poor and the workers, they can't manage, they can't run things, they can't run society. Well, the workers in action actually implemented effectively workers' control. They themselves started to run these companies, and this was a big company. I mean, it was at the time Venezuela was the world's 4th exporter of oil, and all of that was coming from that one company, PDVSA. So you can see they were able to run quite a complicated operation on their own. And, basically, Chavez supported all these measures of workers' control as a defensive thing, but there was no nationally coordinated plan to bring all these companies into a nationalized economy. So it was done kind of piecemeal. The workers themselves took initiative. They occupied a factory that's been sabotaged or that's being abandoned, and Chavez would kind of support that from above. I think between 2003 and 2007, around 1,200 factories were taken over and occupied after being shut down by capitalist sabotage. But the 1,200 factories were not nationalized. That was just kind of the workers occupying them to kind of keep them running. So the point is, again, you can't build pockets of socialism, pockets of workers' control within capitalism. The economic base of the country was largely untouched. The Venezuelan ruling class, the capitalists and imperialism, still controlled and owned key sectors of the economy, including food production and food distribution. And that was a key weapon in the hands of the right wing, because they would basically create artificial scarcity. They would hide stashes of food and create huge problems of hunger, which were fabricated. It was a political tool they were doing to kind of discredit the government and try to overthrow them. I already listed all the coup attempts and so forth. So there's a constant barrage of right-wing attacks trying to get rid of the government. And as a result of all these attacks, Chavez did start to move little by little further and further and further to the left. So he didn't start as a socialist, but then in 2005, famously, he came out and for the first time, he identified the Venezuelan process, the Venezuelan revolution, as a socialist task. He said, "Every day I become more convinced that it is necessary to transcend capitalism. But capitalism can be transcended from within capitalism itself, but through socialism, true socialism with equality and justice." Again, he had very confused ideas. He thought he didn't know socialism for the 21st century. I don't know what that looks like. No one knows what that looks like. We have to experiment. We have to invent, he said, invent a new socialism. So he didn't have a clear idea of how to implement it, but he had read and he understood that we needed to transcend capitalism. He just didn't know how. At that point, 2008, 2009, he does start to nationalize important parts of the economy. For example, dairy plants that were refusing to process milk, causing hunger, nationalized. The cement was nationalized because they needed the cement to build houses for the poor. Sidor, which had been a state company before, it was a steel company, was renationalized because it was being used to make a super profit by exploiting workers and then selling the steel to the world market. And then, all of that would have to be repurchased by Venezuela as manufactured products. So they nationalized the steel company. The problem with all this is that behind, Chavez would make appeals from above. He would say, there cannot be any agreement with the oligarchy or agreements at the top with anybody. He said, "I will make sure that we put our foot down on the accelerator of the revolution. It's time to dismantle the old bourgeois state before it dismantles us." So he started to see all the problems of bureaucracy. The problem, it was just him from above. He had no apparatus. He had no mechanism to actually implement his measures. And he relied on a state and a bureaucracy that was a capitalist state bureaucracy that did not have the interest of the revolution at heart, that wanted to just maintain its perks, its privileges, a bureaucracy that had no confidence in the working class to run society, and at every step actually went against any of the attempts of the workers to occupy factories. They even sent, this bureaucracy would even send in the National Guard and the police to get rid of workers, kick them out of the factories, right? So Chavez would make an appeal from above. The masses would be extremely inspired. They would move into action, and at every stage of the way, the state, the bureaucracy, and the capitalists sabotaged it and got rid of all these attempts. And this really shows that, Marx explained that the state is a committee for managing the common affairs of the ruling class. And the ruling class in Venezuela, again, remained a capitalist oligarchy. And so, of course, the bureaucrats publicly, they would say, yeah, we support socialism. They would get elected, but then they would do the opposite. And they were actually always playing into the hands of the capitalist class. Sometimes they would be elected as Chavistas, and then they would flip right after being elected, and they would basically go totally along with the right wing. And so Chavez could see this, but it was, again, just him, and he couldn't actually change this because he didn't have a party. You had tens of thousands of rank-and-file organizations all over the country, but again, there was no structure, there was no coordinating body. Those structures couldn't actually decide the policy. They were just kind of loose organizations on the ground that didn't have a means to actually elect representatives and carry out those decisions in a coordinated national way. And so even though Chavez said things like, we need to make a revolution within the revolution to get rid of the bureaucracy, all this, that never actually played out. So, comrades, I'm up on time. I just want to say, the Venezuelan revolution has all these inspiring lessons. Chavez led this revolution, which involved land seizures. It involved setting up communes, setting up workers' control, nationalizations, confrontations with imperialism that the Venezuelan workers, time after time, were able to win, and also the discussion of socialism. And above all, I think Chavez had, Alan Woods always says, these left-wing soft leaders, they don't have cojones, they don't have what it takes. They don't stand their ground. And Chavez was the opposite. He had fire, and he actually stood his ground, and he had courage, but it was just him. He had no party. And think about it. It explains perfectly the relationship between the masses, the party, and the leadership. There was one man, there was a leadership who was not a Marxist, who evolved alongside with the movement, but that's too little, too late. Lenin said you can't build a party in the middle of the revolution. You had the masses, but you were missing that key sort of middle gear, which would have been the party to allow to actually implement all the decisions that Chavez was making. In 2006, I just think it's very current. In 2006, Hugo Chavez went to the UN, and he gave the following. Well, it's a short version of this speech, just to show you, what he had in him, in a sense. He said Bush had spoken at the podium the previous day, and he said the devil himself was speaking at this podium yesterday. He said, it still smells like sulfur. He did like a cross. He said, yesterday, the president of the US talked right here as if he owned the world. The spokesman of imperialism gave us his dictate for preserving the US domination, exploitation, and looting of the peoples of the world. The US imperialists say that they want to impose a democratic model, but that is a false democracy of the elites. And what a strange democracy. A democracy that is imposed by Marines, by invasions, through aggression and bombings. The hegemonic claims of US imperialism threaten the very survival of the human species. We appeal to the people of the US and of the world to halt this threat. The world is waking up, and people everywhere are rising up against American imperialism. He then went on to say the US president addressed directly, that was Bush at the time, right? Addressed the people of the Middle East, saying, my country desires peace. And Chavez says, that is true. If we walk through the streets of the Bronx, New York, San Diego, San Francisco, San Antonio, anywhere in the US, and you speak to individual citizens, we will find that the country does want peace. The difference is that the government of the US does not. So he's making a distinction between the ruling class of the imperialist country and the workers and oppressed of the country. If it wants peace, then explain to me what is happening in Iraq, what happened in Lebanon and Palestine, what happened over the past 100 years in Latin America and the world. The US president spoke to the people of Lebanon about being caught in the crossfire. What cynicism, what a shameless lie. How can you speak of crossfire when bombs are being dropped on Beirut with millimetric precision? This is not a crossfire, it's an imperialist fire. It's the genocidal fire of US imperialism and Israel on the innocent people of Palestine and Lebanon. That is the truth. the president of the US had the courage to address all the different peoples. He said, to the people of Afghanistan, to the people of Lebanon, to the people of Iran. He addressed them all directly. But I wonder if those people could speak and talk directly to the president, what would they have to say? I know what is in the soul of the oppressed people. They would say, Yankee imperialist, go home. So, comrades, I wish I could end it here, The problem is, that is so inspiring by what is happening in Venezuela now. Maduro has nothing in common with Chávez. He is a bureaucrat that is just working for his own interest, for the interest of the capitalists, that has repressed working class organization, that has totally strangled all the gains of the revolution. And so, our comrades right now in Venezuela, they have a program where they say defend the rights of the workers and so forth. They cannot support Maduro. In the past elections, they said neither Maduro nor the pro-oligarchic, pro-imperialist right wing. And that's the tragedy of the whole thing, And I would say here, in the United States, our first duty, again, is to oppose any and all U.S. imperialist intervention, to oppose, of course, any right-wing plots within Venezuela, but also to fight to build the Revolutionary Communists of America and to build the Revolutionary Communist International, which is the only stable way that we can actually achieve world revolution and help the workers and poor of Venezuela and the world.
I got to go to Venezuela 13 years ago and witness a little glimpse of the revolution. And I remember the excitement I felt before going and the curiosity for what I was going to find on the ground, because at the time it was being demonized every single day in the media. You would hear headlines about how horrible things are in Venezuela, how much the population hated this tyrant that they had, the dictatorship and so on. So I remember thinking, I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. I'm going to talk to as many people as I possibly can and really try and get a sense of what the mood is. And I remember this started in the airport, in the terminal. You're flying to Venezuela? What do you think of what's going on over there? And there was all hostility. They would talk to me about how, Chávez is a dictator. On the plane, I spoke to some middle-class people who had nothing good to say. And so I started thinking, okay, it's probably going to be a mixed bag. I'm probably going to find a polarized society where you get some people that are for it, some people that are against it. And then I landed. And from the time I was there, those 3 weeks I spent there, to the time I left, every single worker I spoke to, every single young person was a fervent supporter of the revolution, without exception. It was a picture of a society that was polarized along class lines. If you were working class, if you were poor, if you were a normal person, if you didn't own capital, you were with the revolution. If you owned a business, if you were threatened by the idea that your capital might be threatened, then you were against the revolution. It was a class-conscious society, and it was amazing to see. I got to stay with comrades. We had a small group at the time. The International had, maybe 50, 60 comrades at the time, not nearly enough for the task that we had, but I got to stay with them in Caracas and visit a few different cities. And they took me around. I got to see, I got to go into the poorest neighborhoods that used to be slums in the hills surrounding the city. They showed me housing developments that had been built by the state. They showed me neighborhood councils that had set up sports complexes. I saw a basketball court where the walls were painted with an enormous hammer and sickle. I got to see public health clinics that were set up by the state, providing free health care for everybody. There was Cuban doctors that were provided to provide medical attention. I met one of the doctors sat down with me because he heard I was just a visitor wanting to know how things are going. And I was telling him how impressed I was, that, how much I admired this agreement between the Cuban state and Venezuela to have this exchange and to support. And he was talking to me, and I was expecting him to tell me a little bit more about how the clinic worked. And he leans forward and he's like, the thing you really need to study is dialectical materialism. And he just said, I ate at this restaurant. The national staple dish of Venezuela is called an arepa. It's like the taco of Venezuela. And they have a chain. They had a chain that was funded by the state called Arepa Socialista. And you could go in there. It was very cheap food, very delicious. And it was just a huge canteen with workers eating. And everywhere I went, I found people extremely politicized. Everyone wanted to talk about politics. Everyone wanted to talk about ideas, perspectives for the revolution, where are things going, international questions. I met young people that were talking to me about the climate crisis, they were being radicalized. It was this picture of a very politicized environment, just like what you read in John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, where everyone's hungering for ideas. I remember I stayed at a hostel during one time in another city in Mérida, and in the mornings there was a communal eating area for the breakfast and stuff, and I would sit there with my 4 Marxist classics, and people would come up to me and start talking about Lenin and Trotsky. These were part of the national debate. It's no exaggeration to say that Marxism was just something that people were after, people wanted to know about. I went into a newspaper plant, the production facility of a newspaper that had been a right-wing paper that had been attacking the regime for a long time, but it was going broke and it wasn't paying its workers wages. So the workers took over the newspaper. They set up a new editorial board. They transformed it into a workers' paper that would report on the revolution. And I got a copy. I have it at home. I should have brought it. But one of the articles in there was talking about the transitional program, Trotsky's definition of workers' control with a model of nationalization, and saying this is something that should spread. This was just in a regular newspaper that was run by the workers. And I remember taking it back to the hostel and showing another young guest there, a Venezuelan, and saying, look, this used to be a right-wing paper. Now it's a left-wing paper. He says, no, it used to be a lying paper, and now it just tells the truth. You know, there was so much political debate and so many of these people coming up to me having these great discussions at the hostel. I ended up organizing a group discussion one night. I was like, let's have a meeting. And so we bring around like 20 people to discuss the future of the Venezuelan revolution. I put forward the perspective of the International that we need to carry this. This is at a crossroads. We need to carry it out all the way. You need to have the commanding heights, the banks, and the land in the hands of the working class. You need workers' control of industry. And actually, I realized that one of the relatives of the owner of the hostel was a member of the state, of the ruling PSUV bureaucracy, wearing a red polo, said he was in favor of the revolution, but when he spoke in the meeting, his perspective was that the workers aren't ready to take power. He says the workers, they're not conscious enough, they're not ready to take control of society, they just want better wages, but they don't have the consciousness yet. That was the perspective of the bureaucracy, and I remember that was a little glimpse into the outlook of that ruling clique that was basically blocking the revolution. But the most inspiring experience I had when I was there was getting a tour of a factory under workers' control. It was an industrial factory that produced valves for the oil industry. And the workers told me how they had taken it over. It was this long battle that started where the boss, again, wasn't paying the workers, was planning to shut down production in Venezuela altogether and move the plant to Colombia. And he was actually starting to move out the equipment in the middle of the night. The workers would realize that there was like less and less equipment. And so they started realizing they needed to either fight and do something or they were going to lose their jobs and their livelihoods. And I remember that they had some kind of agreement with an attorney, maybe hired by the labor union, that had brought in a camera crew to document the amount of inventory of the equipment in the factory. So there's cameras in the factory, and this happened to be the day that the workers decided they were going to take the plant over, which was something that was happening. You know, they had a point of reference of these experiences that were happening throughout under as a result of the support from Chávez. And so as the camera crew is rolling, one of the workers tells them, when you guys are done, keep the cameras rolling. The show is about to start, actually. And they give the signal. And what they had done in the lead up to this is they had organized an action committee that had sent workers into the nearby neighborhood to talk to the working class and explain their struggle and what their plan was and to mobilize support. So when they gave the signal, they had 200 workers from nearby come and surround the factory gates in support of, and they linked up arms at the forefront of them. One of them steps forward and tells the boss right there, this is now under the control of the working class. We're doing this as a defensive measure. This is now the workers' factory. The boss freaks out, calls the judge, which he has a direct line to, calls the police. But because you had this massive support, the cops weren't willing to go and have a huge clash. The workers had basically occupied it, and it went under their control. The first thing they did was organize a factory committee where they elected delegates from every department of the shop floor to make decisions. They designated production coordinators with a one-year term. They elected one of the workers to be president of the factory. Everyone made the same wage in this particular factory, and they decided how to run production themselves. The first thing they did was give a thorough paint job to the entire factory. They cleaned all the equipment. They repaired the things that needed repaired. They felt like it was theirs now, so they wanted to take good care of it and find the most efficient way to do everything. Our comrades started organizing international solidarity for this factory, and hundreds of messages from strange countries and languages that the workers didn't understand, messages of support were pouring in to these. And on that basis, we built a cell. Our comrades built a cell in this factory. And what they did was they took on the upper floor of the factory, there was a room that had always been preserved for the management. Workers weren't allowed to step foot in there usually. Well, they turned that into a political education classroom for the workers to learn not only about accounting, economic planning, how to run the production, but lessons on historical materialism, on the Russian Revolution. The comrades brought in copies of Lenin's decrees from 1917 on workers' control, and they used this as a model for how to have workers' democracy in that factory, and they started building on that basis. They built a front, a workers' front called Freteco, which means the Revolutionary Front for factories under workers' control, and they started establishing contacts with other factories, a couple dozen different factories that had been taken over by the workers, and linking them up politically to swap experiences and to basically make a political call to spread this movement throughout the rest of the economy. And they called on Chávez to expropriate the factory. Actually, the workers went to a march in front of the National Palace and got Chávez's attention. Chávez comes out to meet the workers, sets up a meeting with them for a couple days later. So these factory workers are coming into the National Palace, sitting in a round table with Chávez, and Chávez is listening to them explain how they took over the factory, how they've been running it, how they've been planning the operations, and their appeal to expropriate it. He says, it's done, it's expropriated. And just like that, this front was basically the cutting edge of the revolution. If you think about, with all of this confusion that was happening in the country, there was one source of clarity that was saying, there is a way to complete this revolution. There is a way for us to complete this to victory and to have the socialist revolution come to fruition. And it was the message being brought by a very small group of comrades. It was like I said, 50, 60 comrades on the ground doing this gargantuan effort, really stretched very thin, but doing a heroic effort to bring that clarity. And if you had been able to do it, you would have seen, I mean, that would have been the only way forward. If you had actually had a few thousand communists on the ground organized to begin with, then you could have had something that could have exploded into a much larger organized force that could have given direction.
You know, Lenin said that whoever wants to see a pure revolution will never live to see it. Such a person talks about revolution and does not know what a revolution is. And again, going back to this definition that Trotsky gave in the history of the Russian Revolution, a revolution is the forcible entry of the masses into the realm of their own destinies. The workers enter the scene of history and actually take control over their own lives and try to change society in order to achieve that life. And I think, you know, from Antonio's intervention and hopefully we gave a picture of how that was actually absolutely the case in Venezuela. And Andrew spoke as well about Chávez, the evolution that he had, the role that he played as an individual who was a centrist in the sense that he wasn't a socialist, but he started to move toward a revolutionary position. He actually, I mean, I could have done the lead of just like quotes of Chávez. So many quotes, very inspiring. He quotes Rosa Luxemburg. He said, socialism or barbarism. We need to build a fifth international. We need to have an international revolution. He said the election victory where he got the most votes was the one where he said, this is not a battle between me and my opposition candidate. It's a battle between socialism and capitalism, right? That's the words he was using. But again, the tragedy is he didn't have a means, a perspective for how to carry out those ideas. And you have to be really really obtuse, frankly, if you don't see the role that a figure like that played, how this was a genuine revolution that was a living process. And in fact, the revolution went on for over a decade. I mean, we're talking about a process that went on for 15 years. Our website is full of articles that says, last warning, the revolution at a crossroads, the coup attempt, the right wing goes on the offensive, another coup attempt. And we're saying, you know, this is a dangerous situation. Will the masses come forward to defend the revolution against these attacks? And time after time, it happened, which showed just how much support the revolution had among the vast majority of the population. If that's not a revolution, I mean, comrades, really, it would be absurd to say otherwise. And there's a lot that could be said about workers' control, I think. When you have just piecemeal, one little factory is under workers' control here, another little factory under workers' control there is no mechanism for the rational allocation of resources, no mechanism for centrally sharing information. There's not even a central inventory of machines and equipment. And so the very same problems need to be solved again, and again, which means there's wasted time and resources. The state does not own the full chain of production, so then the door is left open for the private sector to speculate, to sabotage, to charge huge prices, and and slow down and cause all kinds of chaos and problems. And I mean, again, the majority of the economy remain capitalist. The capitalists produce for profit. If they don't think they're gonna make a good return on what they produce, then they don't produce. And that's what happened. There was like massive flight of capital, taking advantage of the state subsidies of oil and things like that for the private companies to produce very cheaply and then take all those products and illegally, basically, send them across the border to sell them to the world market instead of using them for the national economy. So you can't legislate those things away. You can set price controls, but if the prices don't seem fair to the capitalists, they just won't even bother producing the goods. And that's what ended up happening there. And the example of Inveval, extremely inspiring, right? That Antonio mentioned. But what some of the difficulties they faced is that they depended on components for them to produce what they needed to produce. They depended on components from other factories that were private. So those factories just wouldn't sell to the workers-controlled factories. And even though the workers made appeals, pleas to the government to nationalize all the entire like sort of production chain so that the workers' control factory could continue producing, that actually never panned out. And at the end of the day, the president, I think the same guy that signed that book that Antonio showed earlier, when Maduro came to power, he was removed from his position. And instead they put some kind of military officer in charge of the workers' control factory, and he was arrested on trumped-up charges. And to this day, I think the trial has been postponed for no reason, time and time again, and he remains basically held without trial, which really shows the difference between Chávez and the government that followed him, the government of Maduro. The program that our organization would have put forward at the time is for the nationalization under workers' control of the big food and transport companies and the mass media, non-payment of foreign debt, workers' control and management of PDVSA, which again was a nationalized industry, but wasn't really it wasn't run under workers' control, and therefore there was a lot of still like mismanagement and action against Chavismo, state control over foreign trade, nationalization of the banking system, and the setup of self-defense brigades, workers and people's militias in every single neighborhood, workplace, factory, land, to protect the people, to maintain order, to defend the revolution from enemies within and also enemies from without. That is the program that would have been needed. Also the program of a genuine democracy, like for there to be a process for the election of representatives, Lenin's program on, from the state of revolution, right? The democratic election and right of recall of all public officials, no permanent army, but the people in arms, no official to receive a wage higher than that of a skilled worker, and progressively for the rotation of state functions among all workers, because if all workers are bureaucrats, then no one is a bureaucrat, basically, right? That is the program that could have allowed the revolution to be completed. However, we were saying this, we were too small. That is, again, the tragedy of all this. A party could have grown very quickly. Think about the Bolsheviks. They had 8,000 people, 8,000 trained Marxist cadre in February when the revolution was basically derailed, right? And they supported the provisional government, a capitalist government. You had 8,000 Bolsheviks that had roots in the working class, that had a clear program, peace, land, and bread, all power to the Soviets. And they were able to systematically transmit that program over the course of many months and eventually win over the majority of the working class to actually carry it out. We were putting forward this program, but we didn't have a large enough party that could actually make an impact in carrying out this program. And that is the tragedy of the whole thing. Trotsky said that the masses can sacrifice their today for their tomorrow only up to a certain point. And the Venezuelan revolution was years and years of workers making huge sacrifices for the promise of a better life. But then Chávez, basically, it was just Chávez died. That's how Maduro came to power. Maduro was a bureaucrat in the party. Chávez died of cancer in 2013. And Maduro was elected democratically, by the way. And this is, again, the right wing will lie and say, oh, the dictator usurped power. For many years, Maduro was able to win elections because of the legacy of Chavismo, because he represented, in the eyes of the workers, potentially a continuation of that legacy. But of course, in practice, in reality, it wasn't. But he came to power, and then in 2014, there was a massive drop in oil prices worldwide, a massive crisis of oil, and that basically removed, because the economy was still capitalist, all those reforms were implemented on the basis primarily of the oil wealth. Oil prices go down. How do you pay for all those reforms? And so there was massive, from there on out, it's been basically a decade of massive economic crisis that's only been getting worse and worse because of the attitude that the Maduro government has taken toward it. So the situation today, by the way, in terms of the policies that Maduro implemented, he returned land to the landowners, he led privatizations, he led the destruction of workers' control across the board, smashing any workers' initiatives. He conducted assaults on collective bargaining, driving down wages, things like that. He also imprisoned workers' leaders and peasant activists that were trying to fight back against these policies. And he, electorally speaking, he eliminated opposition. So all those lies of the right wing and the imperialists about it being undemocratic, unfortunately, are actually now true in the sense that he eliminated right-wing opposition, but he also got rid of the left wing and called them escuálidos, the Communist Party of Venezuela, which we have problems with their program and whatnot, but it was, sort of a challenge to Maduro from the left wing, and they got prevented from having a ballot. So you can see this is a Bonapartist regime that is leaning on the memory of the revolution, but at the same time squashing any attempts of the workers to surge forward. And the situation, there's been a collapse of basic infrastructure. We can talk to our comrades. I've met some of the comrades in Venezuela, what it means to survive. During the time of hyperinflation, we think inflation is bad here. Right now, I think in Venezuela, it's 150%, 200% inflation, and it's way calmed down. A few years ago, we were talking 6-digit inflation figures. At a certain point, they made buses free to ride, metro free to ride, not for any reason other than the paper of the ticket would cost more than the value, that would have more value than the cost of the ticket ride, the fare, And so with 1 month's salary, our comrades at the time could buy one whole chicken. So the things they would have to do just to survive, in those conditions, it means that now poor areas, poor workers are coming out and against the government, and these are not necessarily just right-wing protests. In the past, any anti-government protests were right-wing protests, but now these are genuine protests of workers and poor and peasant that are just suffering and want to fight against the government. The problem is that there is no large enough alternative other than the pro-imperialist right wing, the same right wing that wanted to carry out coups, that is supported and funded by U.S. imperialism, is the only opposition party. So like I said earlier, our comrades program right now is, in the election, it was Maduro against the right wing. In the past, we would have called for a critical vote for Maduro, but we can no longer do that because it's Maduro's policies that have led to this situation, along with, of course, sabotage. There's sanctions that have been imposed. Trump imposed an embargo on Venezuela, where they can no longer export oil to the United States, for example, which was a major source of revenue. Billions of dollars imposed by these sanctions, as well as the Bank of England, for example, has robbed all the gold that Venezuela had in the bank. Basically, Britain says no, we're not giving it to you because you're not the legitimate government. So all this kinds of bullshit. So of course, U.S. imperialism played a massive role, but the policies of Maduro have led to the current situation, so we cannot support him either. But we also don't support the oligarchic right wing. And our program is for respect for democratic rights and full freedom for the protesters, respect for the majority of the people, distrust in the pro-imperialist bourgeoisie and in the bureaucracy of the state, and importantly, similar to the US, the building of a class-independent revolutionary party. It's not an easy thing to achieve, but this would be the only way forward for the Venezuelan people to actually make gains. And like Tom said, I just want to finish on that note. What we can do to help our Venezuelan comrades in building that group, building that section, is to build the Revolutionary Communists of America here. We are part of the Revolutionary Communist International, which is doing work in Venezuela, which is doing work in so many other countries in Latin America, in Asia, that are oppressed historically by U.S. imperialism. If we build a strong section here, contribute our time, our money, which also goes, by the way, to the international to help fund the work of these sections, I think we're going to become potentially the U.S., instead of it being a beacon of counter-revolution, of coups, of invasions. United Socialist States of America could become an exporter of revolutionary ideas and revolutionary movements to fund revolutions all over the world. And I think that's the perspective that we need to keep in mind.
In the end, there is a tragedy involved in this, is that there was so much potential. There was such a huge vacuum. There was so much of a desire for the workers to take control, to carry this revolution forward, and a lack of leadership that could show them what the path was. I'll just say I picked up this book, Inveval, which is the whole history of this particular factory that our comrades wrote. I found it in a random bookstore downtown Caracas, and I took it with me to the factory, and the workers signed it, including the president worker who was elected and some others that took me. But one of them told me that we're hoping, we workers here at Inveval are hoping that your comrades in the United States will be portavoces, will be like spokespeople for our revolution, that you'll be messengers and bring this back. And I feel like that's still our role. You know, we're recovering a memory of an event that happened within our lifetime. It happened not that long ago. And this has been crushed and buried by the imperialists, by the media. You're not learning. Who's learned about the Venezuelan revolution for the first time this afternoon? I mean, we have to absorb these lessons and bring this back, because really we're getting a glimpse into our future. We will once again be in a class polarized society. We will find ourselves in a place where the working class wants to take power, and then it's a question of, are we ready as a force to show them the way forward? Everything we're doing in building the RCA will determine whether we're prepared when that day comes again.